Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast, where hope matters. I'm Jimmy Hinton.
And I'm Clara Hinton, and we're so glad that you've joined us.
If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Well, welcome to this week's episode. I have with me again my mother. Hello, Mother.
Hello, Jimmy.
And we're sitting enjoying the sunshine today. 2 days ago it was snowing, and now it's 72 degrees and beautiful. So we have strange weather where we live.
Strange weather, but spring visited today, and we're happy about that.
It's gorgeous. So today we're going to give an introduction to techniques that abusers use. A question that people ask me very often, and especially since we began these podcasts, is, what are specific things that we need to look for? I'm pretty vocal in saying that looking for the quote-unquote red flag behavior, it just doesn't work. It's not effective. I'm not saying that it never works, but I would argue pretty strongly that most often it doesn't work. And we'll discuss a little bit of that in this podcast. But I want to introduce our listeners to this concept of just having a paradigm shift in your mind to where we stop thinking in terms of behavior, or at least behavior alone, and we start thinking in terms of specific techniques. So what are the techniques that abusers use that are common to abusers? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to talk about terminology here a little bit. First of all, I talk about this whenever I put abuse seminars on, but I reject the term grooming. Even though I understand it, I think it's a legitimate term, but I think a more accurate term would be testing. Grooming, I think that kind of implies that there's a systematic kind of tagging, stringing somebody along. You're not really aware that it's happening, and part of that's true. But I think a more accurate way to describe this is that abusers are testing. They're constantly testing the child, and they're constantly testing the adults around that child. So a lot of these tests are very benign in the beginning, and there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tests.
Jimmy, you referenced this a lot last week, so I would encourage anyone who missed last week's podcast, the 8th one, to please go back and reference that, because you went into a good bit of detail about this, and I think it's vitally important to our listeners to grasp this, as you called it, paradigm shift in thinking in order to move forward and really get in touch with this whole idea of technique.
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk about, right now the current research and the material that's out there is looking for quote-unquote red flag behavior. So, and I'm going to explain why it's inadequate. And this will kind of make sense for why you need to have this paradigm shift in your mind. So I'm going to go straight to the source, Dr. Phil. So we're going to use something that came directly off of Dr. Phil's website. And keep in mind, I'm not picking on Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil got this from some of the best experts in the field of pedophilia. So I'm not picking on them. I'm not making fun. I want you to understand that. I'm just explaining why this doesn't work. So he says here, look for these warning signs. And I'm just going to go right down through this bulleted list. Refusal to take responsibility for actions and blames others or circumstances for failures. And so I was kind of going over these with Mom before we started this, and I said, that's so generic. that describes almost all of us.
Absolutely. And as you were saying these, well, I'm thinking, okay, that could be my kids, or that could be me, or gee, that's the people I work with, and that's my circle of friends, on and on and on. And as Jimmy goes through this list, you'll understand more what we're saying here.
Yeah. A sense of entitlement. That describes all three of my children, and that describes about 99% of Americans.
Right.
Low self-esteem. Well, my goodness, I'm in ministry. I don't know of anybody in my congregation who doesn't struggle with self-esteem. Again, none of these tell us anything that's specific to abuse. These are just common characteristics of all of us.
Yeah.
Need for power and control. I looked at Mom. I said, welcome to corporate America. Lack of empathy. That describes
around us.
Three-quarters of the people who I bump into every day have a lack of empathy, at least at different points in their life. Inability to form intimate relationships with adults. We said that doesn't describe your average pedophile. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's because they're able to form intimate relationships with adults that we're so blinded to the abuse.
That they're able to get away with doing what they do because of that.
History of abuse. I think that's based on bad research, that somebody who's an abuser has been abused. That's just been debunked on so many levels. Troubled childhood. I laughed about that, and I said, I don't know that I've talked to a living, breathing human who's not had a troubled childhood to some degree.
Right.
It just these are not red flag behaviors. I'm sorry. And then there's another bulleted list, and this is called Other Tips on Spotting a Sexual Predator. So in my mind, if I see these things, that's going to help me spot a child predator.
Right.
So listen to these. They often offend where they won't get caught. Well, that's true to an extent, but they also are doing much of the abuse in broad daylight. But it also tells us nothing about technique. It tells us literally, okay, so they abuse where they won't get caught. How does that help me spot a predator? It just doesn't. Often married or in relationships. That describes every one of my friends.
Right.
They offend when the victim is handy. And I said, well, if the victim is not handy, obviously they're not offending that child. Again, it tells us nothing about technique. This tells me nothing about how to spot an abuser. Not always strangers. Often family members, family friends, and neighbors. Okay. That tells me nothing. Most attracted to adults. So on the one hand, they say that they have an inability to form intimate relationships with adults, and then in the next breath, they're most attracted to adults.
Which is polar opposite, and as you're saying this, it's like you said, nobody's making fun, just none of this makes sense.
And it doesn't work. It just, it tells us nothing about how to actually spot an abuser.
No.
They're good manipulators. Again, all three of my children are very good manipulators. I was just going to say, every child that I know, or all of you kids, were real good manipulators.
Yeah. You knew how to work your mama. That's for sure.
Salesmen are good manipulators. Sure. That doesn't mean they're child abusers.
Right.
Overly self-indulgent. Again, that describes Western culture. We're wealthy. We live in a wealthy nation. We're all over that. I'm looking at my living room right now where we're recording, and I see stuff. I just see stuff. You know, we're all overly indulgent. Arrogant. Sexualize, objectify women. I used to drive truck. Period.
Yeah.
I'll just stop there.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, that's a whole culture of objectifying women. That's all you hear in not just that industry, but turn on the television.
It's all over.
We celebrate when people sexualize and objectify women as a culture. Abusers of various kinds of pornography. There are all kinds of studies that show, up to 85% of your church members are currently addicted to pornography. So again, this tells us these are not ways to spot a child abuser.
No.
Typically known as rationalizers, intellectualizers, justifiers. Again, it's just these are too generic.
It's so vague. Everything's so vague, so broad scope. It could be one of anybody.
Yeah. The last two here, great helpers. They are there to lend a helping hand. Okay. That describes...
You boys actually are great in your home with your wives. You are helping all the time.
Yeah.
That surely, and I know so many husbands who are like this, that doesn't make them a pedophile.
Right. I mean, these just aren't specific enough. And again, think in terms of technique. Actual technique, step by step. How do they get the child? How do they abuse the child? And how do they keep the adults blind to that abuse? They use stressful and vulnerable situations to get in. In other words, they find a need they can fill, and they use that to get next to the victim. Well, again...
Not always.
Right. And...
Yes and no.
How do you know that somebody's using a stressful and vulnerable situation to get in? I mean, the way that we see it is somebody's just kind and they're helping us out.
Sure.
It's not like they're coming up and they're like, I'm going to use this situation.
No.
It's not obvious, and again, just because somebody's helping somebody in need or helping a vulnerable person
does not mean they are an abuser.
No, it's just too generic. Okay, so I'm going to go to another one. This was a much better list, I thought, but it's still insufficient. This came from thepragmaticparent.com, and the title of the article is Common Tricks a Child Predator Uses, and then the subtitle, Telling Signs of a Child Predator. Don't mind the noise of the paper here. I'm flipping through the pages here.
Now, the reason we're bringing this to everyone's attention is because up until just recently, this is all the information that we had to go on. And since we are living right now in a time that is critical to get the right information out to people as to, how do we spot a pedophile? Can you spot a pedophile? What are the techniques they're using to abuse children? Unless we know some of these things, we'll not make a dent in stopping child sex abuse.
Nope.
So it's important that we have updated, current, and factual good information in front of us.
Yes. So this article lists red flags of a child predator in action. So here's some of the things. Spends most of his or her spare time with children and has little interest in spending time with people his or her own age. I wrote beside this false. That's not true. For your average grooming pedophile, they have no problem spending time with adults. They love spending time with adults. They make relationships really well.
A lot of your abusers are loved within the community. They are in all kinds of social circles. Mm-hmm. They are active within their churches, of course, in the community. They've made good bonds with adults.
Yeah.
Formed wonderful friendships with many adults.
I think when we hear this, we think that we need to start looking for people who they're really awkward around other adults and they don't relate to adults, and so they're sneaking off with a kid and they're acting like a kid themselves. And if that's what we're looking for, we're missing it.
We're missing it.
It's just not accurate.
Right.
repeatedly ignores social, emotional, and or physical boundaries and limits. And I wrote beside that describes most Americans. People are constantly violating boundaries. Anytime I walk into a store, I see people breaking boundaries. I see boyfriends and girlfriends being way too grabby with each other. I hear language that's highly inappropriate in front of children, and people just blurt it out.
All the time.
My wife and I talk about professionals. We walk into stores where people are supposed to have a high level of professionalism, and they're cursing up a storm.
It's on our TVs. It's in our workplaces. It's where we go to eat. This behavior is all over, sadly.
Yeah. Here's another one. Red flag: singles out a child, lavishes them with extra attention, affections, gifts, and develops an age-inappropriate relationship. While that's partially true, it doesn't look like a singling out of children. And this says a child.
Right.
They're not just picking one kid and spending time with one child. It's that they relate well to all children. And that doesn't make somebody a child abuser. So to hear this, it's just too generic. And again, it tells us nothing about their techniques.
Right. We can get so consumed with looking for these traits or character traits, if you want to call them, or whatever, that you miss the whole mark altogether. I mean, a wonderful teacher can be a male teacher, and we often think that abusers are only male, while our most frequent known abusers are male. There are female abusers. But when I think of some of you kids, your best teachers in school around young children and whatnot, they were male. That didn't mean they were abusing you or singling anybody out or, not at all.
Well, we were joking, too, a few months ago, my one second grade teacher, she would see me walking in town because you would send us to the post office, and, the post office is a mile and a half away, and here you'd see her driving me up the driveway,
right.
And she'd pick me up, and it'd be raining or snowing or whatever, and she'd pick me up and bring me home, or she'd invite me into her house, and I'd hang out.
Yes.
I'd hang out in Miss Miller's house, and, and she was great.
Certainly a wonderful lady.
We just saw her on Sunday.
Right. Yes,
Our daughters were both in
the recital.
In a recital together.
Yeah.
And she was absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. But, I think we get these pictures that just, again, tell us nothing about technique. And so now we become paranoid of everybody.
Right.
And say, you can never be alone with my kid. And I think we need to be a little more specific.
Let's put it this way. Pedophiles are sharper than this. They're much more in tune than we are.
Yeah.
And we need to gear up a bit.
Pushes physical boundaries with the child, including hugging, touching, kissing, tickling, wrestling, or holding the child, even when the child resists physical contact or attention. And I just said, this paints a picture of a struggling child and aggressive an adult. That's not really what it looks like. Now, they are touchy and, they tickle and things like that, but I just had this conversation the other day with somebody. If somebody were to take this thing here and watch the way that I interact with my kids, they'd be looking at me and saying, oh my goodness, he's having physical contact with his kids.
Right.
And I have 2 sons and we wrestle all the time.
These lists are scary, and I think they're scary because it groups too many people into this category of, this person has 5 or 6 of these traits, and you can't go by that alone.
Yeah.
For sure, some of these, of course, are identifiable to a pedophile or an abuser, but not just that alone. And that's what we're here to try to explain.
I'll just read maybe one more of these. There are just a handful left, but for time's sake, I'll just read one more bullet point. Appears too good to be true, and is frequently swooping in to babysit your children for free, help out often, takes your children for overnight outings, take your children on special outings alone, buying them gifts for no apparent reason, especially a person who does not have children of their own. Now, I agree with most of this, and I think this is probably the most solid one.
Right.
Somebody who's constantly asking to babysit, especially with the overnighters. They want to have kids overnight in their home. We just have a rule. Our kids don't do overnighters, period.
Which is a great rule.
Yeah. And that's
a safe rule, a great rule.
Just for a whole host of reasons.
Right.
But I don't know that I agree with this, especially a person who does not have children of their own, because all the studies that I've read indicate that the vast majority of pedophilic abusers do have children of their own.
Right.
So I think that's a minor thing, but anyway, you can see how these aren't really specific, and again, they tell us nothing about technique. So my second point, so the first one was, we need to speak in terms of testing rather than grooming, and understand what those techniques are to test people. So as the podcast unfold, we'll talk about those specific techniques.
I don't think we're going to have time in today's to do the whole. Well, we already talked about it. It's going to take a few sessions to do this, but this is real important to grasp the very beginning of this foundation of thinking, so that we can move forward with this and kind of open our eyes together.
Yeah. So my second point here is that practice makes perfect, and I think that's really important. According to Dr. Gene Abel, it was a study done by him and his wife, an excellent study. I think I've quoted this before, but pedophiles have less than a 3% chance of getting caught for every time they have actual hands-on abuse of a minor. So if you think about that, again, I often say, either they're the luckiest people on the face of the planet to abuse dozens, if not hundreds of victims, hundreds of times each. You're talking about thousands of actual times that they created a hands-on victim, and to only have a less than 3% chance of getting caught every time that they did that, they're either incredibly lucky or incredibly skilled. And so that point is practice makes perfect.
Oh, yeah.
They practice. And the irony is that much of their abuse is done in plain sight of the parents and other adults. So, we need to understand this isn't about just controlling a minor and controlling the parents. It's about practicing their skill.
I think, Jimmy, one of the things that maybe needs to be clarified early on is when we think of abuse, most of the time we think of full-out rape, a child screaming perhaps, just horrible, the worst of the worst. Abuse isn't just that. That is where I think it leads to eventually, but abuse can be any number of things to a minor. You want to explain that a little bit, because I know there are people thinking, well, there is nobody under the sun that's going to rape my child in front of me, and I'm not going to see it. And I think it's important to explain that.
Well, I think that's why it's important to speak in terms of testing, too, because from very early on, they're testing both the child and the adult, and it begins with conversational things. So, the father of the victims that Dad was charged on, he said that the very first time he met my dad walked over and he said, "Oh, hey man, how are you? Nice to see you here. I haven't seen you at church before." That was the first time he had ever been there. He was there as a visitor. And then my dad said, "Oh, is there a Mrs. So-and-so?" So that was the first indicator that, in hindsight now, this father knew that my dad was testing him. And so he wasn't just looking for a yes-no answer. He was seeing how he responded. So what happened was, the way that this father describes it, he said he began to talk about his ex-wife and how she was physically abusive and, gave my dad tons of information voluntarily.
Lots of history to build on.
Yeah.
And for your dad to take that information, and the mind started plotting and planning.
Mm-hmm.
And, so it began way back, and you're right.
So from there, there it just went to the physical contact then. So, but benign physical contact. So it was touching his daughters on the shoulder. It was, touching them on the back of their head. It's this benign touching that's non-sexual physical contact.
Okay, now,
but he's seeing how dad responds, and he's seeing how the daughters respond to it. Knowing that the daughters have been physically abused.
And I think that's critical to when we progress with these podcasts, for people to understand there is a very technical progression in abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts out, like you said, very benign. A pat on the head, a simple hug,
mm-hmm.
and then progresses to maybe pulling that child a little bit closer, then sitting that child on your lap, in front of the parent.
Yep.
While the parent watches and nods and smiles,
mm-hmm.
you're setting the stage for future abuse.
Yep.
So
I think it's important to really understand this because there's always a progression. It's never they just take, unless it's the 10% that are grabbers, the open up the car door and pull the kid in. If this is the 90% of child sexual abusers that are groomers, there's always a progression that takes place. And so it's not just looking for quote-unquote red flag behaviors. It's about looking for patterns. It's about looking for a progression where it starts with, hey, I remember this guy asking me about my wife, and I noticed that he used to just pat my daughter on the head, and now he's pulling them in, and now he's hugging them.
Well, he's picking them up and carrying them all around.
Yeah, and getting very comfortable with that.
Right.
And so now, several weeks later, he's asking to spend time with them alone. So it's understanding the technique behind it that's really vital. Because if we're just looking for these generic red flag behaviors, it's not going to work.
Anybody or everybody.
Yeah, it could be anybody and everybody. That's right.
The trouble spot is, Jimmy, that we, as a majority of people, are trusting of friendships. And when we're forming a friendship, we're not thinking along these lines. That's why education is so important. It's important for us to be alert and not get sucked into this abuse, too. And that's just what it is, a mental abuse, So keep going. Didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, that's fine. So then I'm going to end on this point. Everybody knows, or they should know by now because I just use it so often, but I use this analogy of magicians. And again, if you've not seen the video, go back to my website or Mom's website. Go back and watch the video that we did with the neuroscientists, Dr. Macknick and Dr. Martinez-Conde. And it's just phenomenal because their research in trying to understand the neuroscience and how we have these blind spots, they studied magicians. So I use the analogy of magicians because it all boils down to this. A magician is able to do what a magician does because it's all about technique, technique, technique. It's about mastering a technique,
yes,
pure and simple, and understanding how it works, how you're deceived, how your mind reacts,
right,
understanding your belief system,
absolutely,
and hacking that belief system, and just practicing this technique over and over and over and over and over again to where it becomes so routine for them that they know when they do this trick, it's going to work.
It's going to work. I was just telling Jimmy, and I'll say this quickly, I've been intrigued with magicians since seeing this presentation, and please do go back and watch those 2 videos. They are critical to the information we're giving you. But this one magician said, I began as a kid watching videos of other magicians because I was amazed. I couldn't figure out how they were doing what they were doing. So I would sit and replay everything in slow motion over and over and over. And he said it took me years to figure out some of the techniques. And then he began trying them. Of course, the rest is history. When I think back of being married to John, even while we were dating, he told me he studied people. He would sit for hours and just study people's reactions, what they said, what they did, hand motions. And I can tell you that he was masterful at recognizing and knowing how a person would react. On my blog, I have post after post of some of the crazy things he pulled in church. Everything from wearing Halloween masks to hiding chairs to rearranging pews to lighting firecrackers in a church where
during
he was
a
minister
sermon. Yeah.
during a sermon, and he knew his job was intact. He knew how people would respond. He was testing. He was testing a whole lot of things, and one of them was, how can I get away with molesting some of these very children in church? The parents had to just be on his side, so to speak. He did it. He was a master. He was a master.
Well, as you described that magician, what's telling to me is what that magician didn't say is that, boy, I studied, when I was a kid, I studied magicians' quote-unquote red flag behaviors.
Yeah,
I studied,
Nope.
I learned everything about their families, and I learned that, when they got up, they were charismatic, and they had a pretty assistant, and, all these generic things. He didn't study that. What was he studying?
He was studying every technique that they used, and he said he would just put it in slow motion and then stop and look. He was looking, where are their hands? Where are their eyes? What are they doing when they, pull the wool over your eyes? And he said it took him years to get some of these things figured out.
Yeah, so it's not just learning the technique, it's about learning the theory behind the technique.
Absolutely.
And, once we start to do that, and once we have that paradigm shift, it becomes much easier to spot these guys because you have something tangible, something concrete, and it's not something that's so abstract like these other things that I read to you. All these bullet points are so abstract and so generic that they don't tell us how to actually spot an abuser.
No.
So if we understand their technique, and if we understand the progression that they use, and if we understand how they get from point A to point B, step by step by step,
right in front of us,
which most of the abuse that they do happens in front of people. We don't believe that.
Because we don't want to believe it.
Right.
And we've been taught it can't happen that way.
Right. So we assume that this is all just, taking people back to these, their victims back to these quiet, isolated rooms, and that's where all the abuse happens. It just doesn't work that way.
I think in the next podcast, probably, Jimmy and I will actually share specific things that we've been told by children of abuse, where and how they were abused right in front of their parents or in front of a whole church.
Well, I want to close with this quote, and this was on this second article that I quoted from, Common Tricks a Child Predator Uses, Telling Signs of a Child Predator. In the comments section of this jumped right off the page at me. Here's one of the first comments. It says this: sexual abuse happened in our family right under our nose without my husband and I recognizing. We both worked with abused kids and still didn't see it coming.
I just think that is such a powerful testament, Jimmy, to what you're explaining to everyone.
Yeah, here's another comment. Same article, another comment from a different person. I would like to add that not only do you have to watch for the predators seeking alone time with the child, but watch for weird behavior right in the room. My dad was a child molester, and I remember catching him countless times molesting one of my younger sisters, sometimes right there in the room with my family of 8 siblings surrounding him.
That just, I'm shaking my head because that says what we're trying to say. There's someone who said, yep, it's true, right in front of us.
And I think the false assumption that we need to get rid of is, boy, if they know that we're really attentive and we're keeping an eye out in our church, they're not going to want to abuse here. That's totally, completely false. That is absolutely one of the worst things that we can tell people is, boy, if we have this culture of awareness, that's going to scare the abusers off, and they're not going to abuse in our church because they know that we're keeping an eye out. It doesn't work that way. Here's a guy. Listen to this. Watch for weird behavior right in the room. My dad was a child molester, and I remember catching him countless times molesting one of my younger sisters, sometimes right there in the room with my family of 8 siblings surrounding him. She caught him doing it, and believe me when I tell you this, he knew that she was watching him do this.
And I think we'll carry that.
And it didn't matter.
Right. Carry that a step further next week and explain what your dad said about that very type of thing, how it thrilled him.
It's invigorating to them.
Right. Energized him so that he would take things a step further. And I think on that, Jimmy, we've probably given enough for this week of hard stuff. Do you have a truth bomb for us today?
Let's give a truth bomb. The truth bomb is that we need to start studying techniques rather than just behaviors, because until we do so, we're always going to be blind to the abuse. We have got to start thinking in terms of technique. What is it about the specific techniques and skills that these guys are doing? And we need to parse them. We need to understand them. We need to write them out. We need to think through them. We need to understand the theory behind them. And this is it's a tedious process, but the payoff, I think, is incredible, because I think it's going to become much easier to actually spot the abusers in real time and intervene and stop them from doing it.
Intervene and stop it.
Before it gets to the point where they're actually abusing the kid.
Right.
All right. Thank you all for listening this week, and we'll catch you next podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in to the Speaking Out on Abuse podcast with Jimmy and Clara Hinton. You can subscribe to the podcast through either of our websites, findingahealingplace.com, jimmyhinton.org, or through iTunes. Please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode.